So right away, let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, the reviews are changing format slightly. Whereas before I would just upload traditional gameplay footage and an overlay commentary on top of that, I decided to, change the style of doing them. So older viewers of mine might remember that I used to do sort of vlog-style reviews like you're seeing now. I would just basically get my webcam out and record myself basically ranting about games for half an hour to 45 minutes. And, these days I'm going to do it in a little bit more of a constructive, more concise manner. And so, but I wanted to kind of bring a new format to reviews, as I felt like the traditional format that I was doing has been, the one that has gone through the least changes in all the years that I've sort of done YouTube. And so, with that being said, I want to talk about basically the first game that released in 2023. And unfortunately, we don't have good news to start us off this year. We're going to talk about Forspoken. So Forspoken is the latest game from Square Enix. Now, what excited me most about this game was actually two reasons. The first of which is that we actually saw this game revealed with the PlayStation 5. It was under the title Project Athia at the time. And it showcased some gorgeous visuals, like beautiful vistas, incredible landscapes, and just dense environments. The amount of detail that we saw on screen was just, impeccable in terms of bringing out the next-gen quality. And so the bar was set extremely high by Square Enix and Luminous Productions, who were developing that game. And, it went through a bit of a, development cycle here. 3 years later, we now have, the actual game in our hands. It went through a couple of delays to get us there, but, we finally have the game. It actually came out under the title Forspoken. The second thing that excited me most about Forspoken was the fact that it was being developed with the Luminous Engine. This was the second game only in history that would be developed with this engine, the first of which was Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy 15, when it came out, was a beautiful game. Still by this day is still, I would think, a gorgeous game by many people's standards. And on top of that as well, at the time it was sort of an ambitious project, Final Fantasy 15. It didn't exactly run really well on those current generation of systems at the time. But thinking about what this engine can do with basically no headroom, bringing it over to a next generation console, and then just basically hitting the bar at a quality level pretty high. It was an exclusive developed for the PlayStation 5, but also coming to PC with really steep requirements, I might add. So really, the visual quality, everything that possibly could have been going for this game, we had every reason to be excited for basically the top quality visual presentation that we were hoping to get with Forspoken when it came out. Well, we're going to talk about all of that and more when it comes to the development of Forspoken, what my feelings are about the game after playing it after all these years, and also the visual quality and how I felt it really stacked up against the competition on the PlayStation 5, which is the version that I played myself. So I played the demo for Forspoken. In fact, I uploaded a video playing through the entire demo of Forspoken with live commentary for the first time as I was going through it. And towards the end of that demo, I was sort of left, very divisive on what the whole entire experience was going to be like. I was really hoping that the combat was going to just nail down the velocity and the visceralness and just the, incredibly chaotic nature of what they were showing to us via trailers and all that stuff. But unfortunately, that's not the case here with Forspoken. The combat sort of left me feeling very mixed after the demo, and because of the way that it sort of dealt with transferring different spells, and there's different combos and different, slight abilities, and these have different gameplay styles, the potential for what the game would play like when all this stuff is unlocked was actually pretty exciting, but it was just sort of a slow grind in the demo. I didn't really enjoy the combat based off of what I played with the demo, and so I was going into the game really hoping that the storytelling was gonna be there. After playing a 24-hour playthrough of the game, trying my best to invest myself into the world, doing all of the content that I came across, unfortunately, the storytelling, I felt, while does improve towards the end of the game, just for the most part felt creatively confused and very just weird. I always try my best to visualize what the developers were envisioning. And by now you've probably heard all the criticisms surrounding the game's writing. You know, that it has very amateurish writing, that the writing itself feels like a joke, like one massive joke, that it takes itself way too seriously, but doesn't really have the skill set to actually match it up. While the writing for me wasn't the main issue, I felt that this game was just sort of a just jumbled mess at times. The story starts off in this rather emotional and very heavy-handing, type of scenario. You basically have a young girl here who's been, left alone for her entire life. She's an orphan. She's run away. She's basically living in an abandoned apartment complex, completely homeless with nothing but her cat. And she keeps getting in trouble with the law. She's been sent to courts for just, sort of petty robbery and all that stuff. And, the game has some really dark themes that it kind of thrusts you into right into the beginning of the experience. I mean, at one point, the character even contemplates suicide, and it shows her literally on top of a rooftop, about to jump off. So she's in a very dark place, and this story starts off with some really, dark themes. And this sort of paves way to what could have potentially been this incredible story about finding self-worth and self-confidence and all of this stuff. But unfortunately, the story doesn't deal with any of these themes. In fact, it almost just completely forgets the original intro and just thrusts you into this magical world. And this is sort of where the dialogue comes into play, where, people start really having sort of issues with the cringe lines and the sort of very, amateurish style in terms of them conveying the actual story and the writing of these characters and whatnot. Now, it is important to note that while many people have issues with the dialogue between the main character and her sentient cufflink that she wears that actually has a voice and participates in the storyline, it sort of adds as like a companion mechanic. It basically gives her all the powers and abilities that she has. And so as you're kind of going through, the storyline, these two characters kind of start off, and both of them have different motives. One doesn't realize exactly what's happening, and the other is just trying to basically, get the hell back home. And so there's kind of like this constant, drama that's sort of unfolding between these two characters. Honestly, I don't feel that any one particular person is well developed whatsoever. The game does a decent job at setting up sort of the main villains in the game, and it gives you sort of a backstory to the world and sort of what what these villains were actually doing, why they became corrupted, and basically, what exactly their role is in this present universe. But in terms of the main character here, and this is where I really felt that the game dropped the ball the most. You just had so much potential here for just this really meaningful, deep story about depression, finding self-worth and self-confidence, and anyone who's sort of been there on the edge, who's been in a really dark place. This could have been a story that, while fantastical, could have at least conveyed the themes necessary for, I think, a lot of young people and just people in general go through in their daily lives. I mean, I've certainly been in dark places, and, while I haven't gone that far, there's definitely been moments where I've thought about, different dark situations like that, and whether or not it was all worth it. So, I mean, this is a story that I feel could have really dealt with these really deep themes and could have actually had a very important message that, had an ending here that, while made sense for the storyline that they were telling, at least put the character in an important place and conveyed an important message to the actual people participating in this experience. And it's so unfortunate to me. This is perhaps the game's greatest sin, is that it fails to deliver on any of those principles whatsoever when it comes to the storyline. And instead, it opts for your traditional sort of fantasy-oriented storyline. You have a character here who gets powers. She becomes all-powerful. She's the chosen one, and then she saves the day, essentially. It's like you've seen this story 1,000 times before. I don't want to spoil too much information because there is actually a decent twist, sort of later on in the storyline. You start to understand exactly what went wrong here. And there are some, expectations that I had where the game kind of played with that. But for the most part, I just felt that this was a very sort of generic and traditional sort of approach to storytelling when it came to a game of this style. And it misses the mark so much on trying to actually convey anything meaningful, anything worthwhile. And I just felt that overall that the narrative could have used a lot more time in the oven and probably just better writers. This to me is just amateur story work at very best. In fact, I think I enjoyed the drama of Final Fantasy XV's story more than I enjoyed Forspoken. Final Fantasy XV at least had intrigue and, you know, had some good twists, and you had sort of this world that you wanted to be a part in. Forspoken is this very just jumbled together mess, as I said before. It feels that this game is often creatively confused, like it went through a few different development cycles, a few different directors who all had different ideas, and then the game was sort of this, you know, pieced together bits, right? It was kind of like a puzzle with all these different missing sections, and the developers were just like, all right, let's put that in there, let's put that in there, this fits, and let's just get the game out the door. It just fails to really deliver on anything I feel is worthwhile or meaningful in terms of a gameplay and storytelling experience. Let's talk about the graphics really quick, and more specifically, this world that you're going to inhabit, Athia. Athia is substantially large. In fact, it's much larger than I ever thought this game was going to be. And in fact, it's a bit too large for the game's own good. It's very bizarre to me because the game has story moments that take place in this large open world. But there are large chunks of the world that if you just follow through the story path, you will never ever see. And so most of the game world, it felt to me that the decision to make this game more open world instead of like a hub style or level based structure, which I would have felt would have been better for this game, it didn't really need to be open world. Most of this world is sprawling landscapes, and quite honestly, the art direction, albeit in addition to that, the actual quality of the graphics is very, very subpar. I understand why, if you played the demo, why the game takes place in that particular section in the demo. It's the most beautiful area in the open world out of the entire game. Basically, every other section of the open world has different sort of art directions. Like, everything's kind of cornered off. You have a more desert area, you have an area that's kind of like dark and raining all the time, an area that's kind of like, you know, stuck in storms and all this stuff. And so the game has like these different, you know, artistic directions that it locks off to different parts of the world. But quite honestly, most of these worlds are just plain ugly. Not just in graphical detail, although the graphics at the time are sort of subpar at best. But the art direction itself is just really, really bizarre. It feels like, and I'm not even sure what the developers were trying to go for, because when I was playing this game, I mean, I wanted to spend the least amount of time in some of these areas as possible because it was just this overabundance of extreme saturation of colors with little to no rhythm to the actual art direction whatsoever. It's like you go into an area and it just looks like muddy, like a soup of just different colors and all this stuff put together. I did not want to be a part of some of these worlds at all, to be quite honest with you. And the area that you saw in the demo, the area that you got to explore in the demo, is the most beautiful section throughout the entire game. And it's no wonder that they actually chose that section for the demo, because it's the only part that actually looks relatively normal. Everything else is kind of all corrupted, and I guess what they're trying to go for is that, you know, this world has undergone a corruption. There's basically this hazy fog, and everything in this fog gets corrupted. The animals turn into just these horrible mutated beasts. The actual people become under this like trance of like dark magic and greed and all this stuff. I see what they're going for with this, is that they want you to understand that this is a beautiful area that was corrupted by all this darkness, and now it's ugly. I get that. But after you defeat the corruption in these areas and you finally get what the world is supposed to look like, it's not that attractive whatsoever. And it's not the visuals, it's the actual art direction. That is the main issue that I found with this game. Now, the visuals themselves, this is a PlayStation 5 exclusive, alright? Also on PC. But if you have a PC, this game is, I think, the very first game that actually I've seen that requires up to 32 gigabytes of RAM, which is just significant. Even by today's standards, you're pretty much fine with getting by with 16 gigabytes of RAM. When I built my computer in 2015, I basically spared no expense and put 32 gigabytes in that system, and it was I saw only a handful of games actually utilize more than 16 gigabytes at a time. But this is a game. The point is that this is a game that has very hefty PC requirements. And for what the game requires, for the target platforms that this game is a part of, the visuals that you are getting on display are not anywhere near what you would expect or hope for from a next generation game experience. The only thing that actually looks very attractive in this game are the spells. They utilize incredible amount of particle effects and just all these debris and just everything that's basically gone into the game. So when you're casting these spells, what you're seeing on screen and all these effects sort of happening on your television will impress you, especially when you're playing with HDR and it just kind of blows up these highlights. It can be blindingly bright at times, and also there's so many effects on screen that you'll have a hard time keeping up with the combat itself. I see what they were going for in terms of making the combat as kind of chaotic as possible, but unfortunately the actual gameplay isn't able to keep up or isn't as exciting to actually play and utilize as what you're seeing on screen. So essentially it looks a lot cooler than what it actually plays like. Lighting itself is some of the worst lighting that I've ever seen from a current generation game. In fact, some last generation games have looked significantly better than this, and I was playing this entire experience utilizing the ray tracing mode, which essentially gives you ray trace shadows near the character at 40 frames per second. If you have a 120 hertz TV, you can output in 40 frames per second. The game doesn't look that particularly great no matter which mode you're actually playing on. The resolutions themselves are all upscaled and all done with FSR2, and so the game looks rather blurry sort of in motion and doesn't look as attractive, especially when you have all these particles up on screen and you're moving at a quick pace with the motion blur and all this stuff. The image can break apart in motion, and so it doesn't really particularly look very good at all. It's only when stuff really starts heating up, some of the fire effects and the water effects and basically any of the more minute spells look pretty good in motion, but the vast majority of stuff that you're seeing on screen is rather flat and very last gen looking. In fact, I would say this game more looks like a game that was around in like 2016, 2017, probably around there. But even so, there are some games on PS4 and Xbox One, especially if you have the Pro and enhanced models, that actually look significantly better than this game, especially in the lighting. Even Final Fantasy 15, which was the developer's previous project, looks more impressive visually than what you're seeing with Forspoken. And so this to me basically speaks to two things. Either this game went through an incredibly difficult development life cycle, and there was just a lot of stuff that kind of went wrong with the project, and like I mentioned kind of before, the game seems creatively confused. Maybe it went through a few different iterations. Or the game's been in development for many years. Maybe just after Final Fantasy 15 they were developing this game and it was targeting PlayStation 4, and they quickly updated their assets to work with PS5. So I don't know if that was the case or not. We don't really have much of an answer, and the developers aren't really speaking on this. But quite honestly, if you just want to know more about the game's visual design, I'd recommend watching the Digital Foundry video. They did a great job just highlighting some of the errors and issues with this game's visual output. Now, during motion, are you going to necessarily nitpick at all these things? I mean, the game looks passable at best. I did not feel that I was getting a next generation game experience. The only part where I actually was reminded that this is a PS4 game is the spells. When you're basically casting these giant spells and these giant effects are coming on screen, these big explosions, that looks pretty cool. But outside of that, when you're just kind of perusing through the world, parkouring around, running around, and all these sprawling landscapes, I mean, the draw distance is a little bit impressive, sure, but the actual detail up close leaves a lot to be desired. And I noticed actual loading issues with textures. And so certain objects that the characters are wearing, such as clothing, different elements of like the wall and the ground and stuff, sometimes that would take a couple seconds to load, which is a bit odd because this game has some of the quickest load times of any open world game I've ever played. In fact, of any game period. It literally takes 1 second to load. You fast travel from one end of the world to the other, the game fades to black, it fades back in less than a second, and you're basically at that part of the world. It's some of the quickest loading that I've ever seen in any single game, and you can see that they utilize the actual SSD power within the PS5, but man, the actual visual presentation, I mean, I guess that's part of why the game loads so fast, is because you're not really loading really enhanced visuals. Even the ray tracing, which you would expect to be very robust and to give this game at least a next generation look, fails to do anything at that. It is some of the most minute ray tracing I've seen in any of these next generation games. I mean, there's been some other games that have utilized ray tracing much more effectively, and there's been some games that didn't utilize ray tracing that have looked better than this. So the storytelling is disappointing, the visual presentation is nowhere where it needs to be. I mean, I guess at the very least I can praise the game's soundtrack, which, at the start it kind of tries to convey its themes. It mixes sort of modern hip-hop with sort of your more cinematic, fantastical scores of what you would expect with a game of this style. It kind of grew on me as the game sort of progressed towards the end. There's some pretty cool music that happens during the large-scale fights. But for the most part, I felt that this was passable. I'm not going to run out and buy the soundtrack. Bear McCreary, who worked on the God of War soundtrack, actually had a hand in this game's audio design as well. So, that does, I think for those brief moments where the soundtrack really sort of shined through, it was probably his involvement, being as the God of War soundtrack's incredible. I mean, outside of that, you really have gameplay that's left, which I've already kind of conveyed isn't really that great. There's basically a couple issues with the gameplay of this game. It's not so much that the game doesn't play very well. It's okay, it's passable. The combat has a bit of a rhythm that you can get to later on towards the experience, and towards the end of the game where you actually unlock all these different spells, the game actually quite opens up, and it can be very fun to kind of switch off between the different spells that you're casting. But this game has an issue with the way that the controls feel to the player actually handling the controller. One of the things I'm going to say right up front is that if you're going to play this game, despite what the reviews and myself have to say, and I encourage everyone to play the game for yourself. This is only my opinion. I can only speak about my experience, my expectations and stuff playing the game. So if you do have any interest in the game, and if you haven't played it up already and you're waiting for a sale, make sure, my best recommendation for the way that this game plays is to do this. Go into your settings and switch the L2 and R2 trigger functions to be the L1 and R1 bumper buttons. The reason I say this is that this game utilizes spells and basically an array of different ranges of spells. And so you have your sort of, individual attacks which you can use by pressing down constantly on the trigger. And then you basically can hold the trigger to basically have a powered up attack and shoot that powered up attack at an enemy. The game does utilize as well the more trigger intensity functions of the DualSense controller, and I felt that for actually playing the game and casting the spells, because you're constantly pushing down on the R2 button and you're constantly getting resistance, my finger was in pain after a couple hours of playing the game because there's no relief. You're just constantly doing this, and the game is actually resisting. The triggers on the DualSense are resisting your movement every single time, so you have to apply intense force to actually get the spells to come out as you're fighting, especially with all these enemies around. Sometimes you'll be invaded with dozens of enemies at a time, and you're just constantly pressing the trigger button. So I actually found that this game has fully remappable button inputs for all of its control schemes. So I went into the settings and I switched the trigger functions to be the bumper buttons, so the traditional L1 and R1 buttons, and pushing those bumper buttons instead of the triggers. Now, granted, you don't get the actual trigger resistance when you change this, but it made the combat so much better, so much more bearable. It actually relieved all the pain that I felt in my index finger from constantly pushing down the trigger, getting resistance with the controls and whatnot. So thankfully, you're able to do this, and I would highly recommend it because now the gameplay is a lot more similar to what you sort of normally expect. And honestly, you're not missing much with the trigger, resistance. It, to me, was one of the more pointless experiences for this game. It doesn't transform the game experience in any way, and all it does is it adds extreme pain to your finger because you have to apply more pressure, and as you're applying more pressure, the trigger is applying more resistance, and it was not a good decision. I do not know why they actually have the trigger intensity options for this type of game, because it doesn't really work in this style of game, I feel. Now, you can adjust the level of intensity and resistance for these triggers within settings. However, I changed mine to low and my finger was still hurting, so I just changed the option to be off. And I actually felt that because of the shorter throw pattern of the bumpers, for me it drastically improved the gameplay when I was playing this game and just made the whole combat bearable and not painful whatsoever. So I want to put that out there. Now, you have 4 different spells that you'll be unlocking during playing this game, and the game towards the end does get a lot better because you have all these different spells, and certain enemies will have resistance or vulnerability to certain spells, and so you'll have to be basically switching off in between. And the actual maneuverability, your way of getting across this world, to me, improves a lot more towards the end of the game, where you start getting more spells that make your whole traversal a lot faster, your maneuverability as a character a lot better. I mean, towards the end you basically get ice powers where you can essentially surf across water, large bodies of water, which just allow basically exploring the game to be a lot more interesting and fun. So yes, the game gets better towards the end of it. However, the journey to get there, the time it took for me to actually find that fun, it really, really tried my patience. And this game, in its first many hours, I'm talking about 10 to 12 hours, is going to really try your patience. Now, if you just completely ignored all the side content and did the story, you can get through this game in probably 15 to 20 hours. It's a relatively short game, and this sort of speaks to the unfortunate disappointment that the storytelling brings, because it doesn't have enough time to convey any of its themes. It doesn't have enough time to actually develop these characters whatsoever. It doesn't have enough time to actually do this. And so, you're going through the game at a relatively quick pace. Now, if you want to do content, side content, there's so much this game offers you. Most of it is completely meaningless, meaning it has no story behind it. You're just simply doing stuff to unlock things. You'll be doing certain, optional towers and dungeons that basically give you maybe different clothing items or different necklaces that have different stats, or different, she does like fingernail paint and stuff like that. So different things like that will give you different stat bonuses. Most of it is cosmetic. It has zero storyline around it. And some of the side content that does have storytelling, unfortunately, doesn't have anything important to really convey. Most of it is completely separate and doesn't develop any of the side characters whatsoever that you're actually interacting with. So most of the time, this game feels like it was sort of a, handed in, generic sort of experience, and like I said, one that kind of went through a lot of different development cycles and creative decisions behind it before they landed on exactly what they wanted to do. Forspoken is unfortunately not the game that we were all hoping for. I can't even say it was a next generation showpiece, because it wasn't. It was a game that I felt was disappointing in almost all aspects of its design. Its storytelling was not there to actually make up for the muddied visuals. It's, again, the visuals, as I said, were just, it's not just the graphical detail, it's also the art direction. The game fails to convey any sense of beauty besides the main area of what the demo took place in the open world. So, I mean, that's like the most beautiful section in the world, and most of the time the world is barren. It's basically sprawling landscapes, hills, mountains. There's nothing interesting that happens here. The game doesn't even have dynamic weather. It doesn't even have dynamic a day and night cycle. It doesn't have any of this. You're just basically running through the world and it's the same every single time. They do occasionally have these brief moments where a big storm will roll in and it spawns all these enemies. It's like a random challenge encounter thing. I don't know, but there's no there's no special like weather effects or tornadoes or anything that really make this game a little bit more worthwhile on the visual side of things. The soundtrack is interesting at some portions, but doesn't really convey anything worthwhile or worth listening to. And the gameplay is frustrating, but does get fun towards the end. It's just that it takes such long of a time to actually get there and to really, enjoy the combat for all the spells. It doesn't spend enough time, giving you all these powers and training you on how to utilize these skills properly as well. There's just so much here to unlock, and the game is just filled with content, but the majority of it is really not worth your time. And I just felt that the game was a rather forgetful, experience. And, most of the time I try to look at sort of the good for games. I think many people have this idea that I sort of like everything, and that's not the case, but I sort of always look to games as needing to do two things. Number one is the experience needs to be there, and that's always going to be a subjective thing. But number two is the quality of the game. I will say that the quality of Forspoken, I only ran into one crash during the entire game. I didn't really run into any glitches whatsoever. The game was very well polished for basically the entire of my 24-hour playthrough. So if you want to play the game, albeit with all these other issues on the creative side, if you still want to play the game, it is a polished experience, I would say, that you can play it from start to finish with relatively zero bugs whatsoever. So I feel that the game is polished, but I just don't feel on the creative side that all the pieces were there to really create something that was meaningful. And honestly, when you have visual quality that you were showing to people with the launch of the PS4 that just looked mind-blowing at times, what they were trying to achieve there, and then you come out with this, which isn't even comparable. I mean, I think that this is a worse downgrade than the Watch Dogs graphics from E3 2013 or 2012 or whenever that was. You all remember the controversy surrounding that. I think this is a worse downgrade, quite honestly. This game doesn't even convey next generation in anything but its spells and big effects, and those are only some of the times. And on top of that, you also have frame rate issues. The game actually drops frames pretty regularly and runs well under 30 FPS, and if you're playing, in the frame rate mode, basically VRR won't even help you because the game runs in the low 40s. So the game is just not well optimized on that front, but at least it's glitch free. At least the polish of the experience is there. There just needed to be something else here. There's a lot of things missing that are making this, that could have made this, a more compelling experience. That for me is just going to come up as just a forgettable game. So that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed the review. Let me know if you guys like the new style of reviews. Basically, I'm going to try and do this for all the sort of the major games that come out. They won't always be as long as this one, but I'm going to try to overlay some gameplay on top of that. And I hope you guys enjoy this as a different change of pace. And I'll see you guys for the next one. Thank you very much.